Does the Bible condone slavery and genocide? If you've ever picked up a Bible and read it, you would know that the answer is an obvious yes. But Cold Case Christianity is here to take a CSI approach and tell us why it in fact does not condone slavery and genocide. Let's get into it.
Does the Bible condone slavery?
Yes.
When I first started reading through Scripture, I started to see that there were descriptions in the New Testament and the Old Testament involving slaves. And these descriptions were relatively benign, as though we were to take for granted the existence of slaves. Does God condone slavery?
That made no sense. He just said no words right there.
In the New Testament and the Old Testament involving slaves. And these descriptions were relatively benign, as though we were to take for granted the existence of slaves. Does God condone slavery?
That made no sense.
Does God just accept this as just the way it's going to be, the way it's always been?
Yes.
How could that be? I couldn't imagine a God that would condone such a horrific thing. But I think part of the problem is in answering this kind of...
What do you mean you couldn't imagine a God that would condone such a horrific thing? It's your God that you're describing your God. You can imagine a God. You believe in this God. You worship this God.
objection is just understanding the definition of slavery. Look, when we hear...
That's fair. Let's get a very clear and concise definition of slavery. Here's a definition that I like to go with. Let's compare it to his.
Hear that word, we always refer...
Slavery, a condition compared to that of a slave in respect of exhausting labor or restricted freedom.
in our mind to what we know as New World slavery, right? The kind of slavery that we engaged in here in America that was so
Waiting for the definition.
repulsive. But is that the same as ancient Near Eastern slavery? Even though the word may be the same, is the concept the same?
Okay, I don't care about this argument. I'm granting the argument right off the bat. The concept is different. It isn't. The Bible condones chattel slavery. But let's just, whatever, it doesn't. Fine. What's the definition of slavery? Fine. Biblical slavery and New World slavery, they're different. What's the definition of slavery?
They are two very different things in a number of ways. Number one, the benefit, the financial benefit that slavery offered in the New World was that the slave owner got all the benefit. In the ancient Near Eastern version of this term, often it was the slave himself who entered into slavery.
I like how he said in the ancient Near Eastern version of this term, not in the ancient Near Eastern version of slavery. I mean, that's what he's talking about.
Because of a financial debt that was owed. As a matter of fact, that's another way.
Okay, fine. What he's talking about is debt slavery or indentured servitude. It doesn't matter. That's still a form of slavery and it's still immoral, but that's not the form of chattel slavery that is condoned in the Bible. I wonder if he's going to get into that.
Way that they were different.
It doesn't.
The way into
Okay, it doesn't matter if they were different. Slavery is slavery. The rules that follow slavery, those may be different. Some versions of slavery may be better than others. Some may be worse. But you're still a slave. It doesn't matter how good the slavery was or how bad the slavery was. Does it condone slavery?
Slavery in the New World, of course, was involuntary. People were subjugated into slavery. But in the ancient Near East, often people entered into this kind of servitude.
Okay, so in Exodus, what part of this was voluntary for the daughter? If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. What part is voluntary for the daughter? She was sold by her father. And if you take Leviticus 25:44, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy, some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them you can give them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. What part of this is voluntary? What part of this is voluntary?
voluntarily to pay a debt. As a matter of fact, the way out of slavery was different, right? I mean, in the New World, there was no way out of slavery. In the ancient Near Eastern, there were several biblical pathways for slaves to be freed. Actually, the way slaves were treated was even different. In the New World slavery we think about, slaves were treated as property. In the ancient Near East, they were given the same rights, and they were actually...
The word property is literally in Leviticus 25. It says they will become your property. What are you trying to say here? We just read the verse.
Laid out by biblical mandates the rights that other human beings are given. Why are these two things so different? Well, let's just be careful when we talk about what it is God might condone. Are we talking about the kind of New World slavery that we think of today?
Yes, but for the sake of this argument, I will say no. We're not talking about the New World slavery. Oh, put that hand down there, buddy. Put that hand down. We're not talking. Fine, I'm granting the argument. Now, we just read in Leviticus 25 that it is the same. This is chattel slavery. Chattel means personal property. Slavery, well, we went over that. But fine, for the sake of argument, it's 100% different. It doesn't matter. You're still a slave. It meets the definition of slavery. Even the type of slavery that he's referring to in the Bible, and not the type of slavery that he's ignoring, it still meets this definition. Exhausting labor or restricted freedom. I would say and restricted freedom. It meets the definition.
Or something very different. And it's different in really the way you entered, the way you got out, the way you were treated while you were there. Very different concepts. But let me give you another thing to think about as you try to answer this briefly. We have certain things in place, certain institutions in place that answer or solve certain problems for us. So for example, if you're in debt to a financial institution, well, we have financial institutions that could figure out what to do with that debt. If you don't pay your debts, you're going to end up in some kind of legal trouble, and you may actually go to jail. Well, it turns out we have financial institutions today, and we also have penitentiary systems today to deal with these two issues. Those weren't in place in the ancient Near East. If you were somebody who had a debt in the ancient Near East, there was no financial institution to kind of come and mitigate that debt, and there were no penitentiaries that could place people in custody. The vast majority of people who were involved in voluntary servitude, called slavery, were people who had a financial debt to pay off, or were people who had...
You know, I often remember to think of the Lord's Prayer when I hear these type of apologetics. Why didn't God do the whole Lord's Prayer back in the day and forgive your debt as we forgive our debtors? It would have made a lot more sense than enslave your fellow human.
Committed a war crime or other crime that they were paying off. Those systems were in place to deal with wrongdoers or people who were in debt. And if they didn't have the institutions that we have today,
So why didn't God give them the institutions? God did nothing except for say, hey, you can own people as property.
See why they might resort to other means to solve those two problems. So let's be careful when we talk about slavery and what kind of slavery, quote unquote, God would condone. Different way
Chattel
in,
slavery,
different way out, a different way you were treated while you were there, a pathway that could get you out. And it's really only a last resort because they lack the kinds of institutions and structures that would take care of the problem.
So he's quite literally saying, yes, the Bible does condone slavery. It's just different than the type of slavery you're thinking about. It's a nice kind of slavery. It's a pleasant slavery. It's a slavery everybody would want. It's for your children. It's for your family.
Problem
Come
in a
on.
different way. And finally, let me just give you one last thing to think about. The same Bible that people say condones slavery was the text that the abolitionist movement used to free the slaves.
Oh, get out of here. It was also the text that the slave owners used to keep slaves. Stop it.
The same Bible that was misinterpreted
Stop it right now.
to condone New World slavery when the Bible was not describing New World slavery to begin with is the same text that Wilberforce...
Leviticus 25 quite literally describes chattel slavery. Tell me how Leviticus 25 is different from New World slavery, as he calls it. Tell me how it's different. You can buy your male and female slaves from the nations around you, like, I don't know, say Africa. You can buy some of the temporary residents living among you. They will become your property. You can give them to your children. You own them for life. Please tell me how this is different than chattel slavery. This is chattel slavery.
Course, used as part of the abolitionist movement. On the basis of what was that movement started? On the basis of a biblical notion that all of us are of the same family, that we are not to be treated differently, that there is no race in the eyes of God, that humans look at the outward condition of man, but God looks at the heart, that we have a certain dignity as humans in the image, created in the image of God, that there is no brown race, white race, yellow race, red race. There's just a human race in the eyes of God. That is the clear teaching of Scripture and the teaching that motivated and propelled the abolitionist movement. Does the Bible condone slavery?
Yes.
Of course not. But does it describe slavery? Yes, it does, but not the slavery that you might be thinking of. Does the Bible condone genocide?
I mean, I think it's pretty well refuted that the Bible 100% does condone slavery. And he went through all of these descriptions of how, yes, it does in fact condone slavery. And then just says, well, of course it doesn't condone slavery. We're going to do, does the Bible condone genocide in the next one, and try to keep this a little bit short.